Pendulum monsters are the hottest new addition to the Yu-Gi-Oh! Trading card game. Pendulum cards are different because you can play them as either monster cards or spell cards. You can play them as spells in the new Pendulum zones that have been added to the game mat. Once you play 2 Pendulum monster cards as spells in your Pendulum zones, you can perform a special Pendulum Summon. Now let's take a look at the new Pendulum zones. The Pendulum zones are these 2 new zones on the field. This is where you can play Pendulum monster cards from your hand as spell cards during your main phase 1 or 2. Just place the Pendulum monster cards face up in the zones. If a Pendulum zone is already occupied, you can't play a new card in that zone. Pendulum monster cards have a lot of extra info because they do so much. So they have 2 effect text boxes depending on how they're played. If you activate a Pendulum monster card as a spell in your Pendulum zone, it stays on the field and you can use its Pendulum effect written in the top box. You can also summon or set a Pendulum monster card as a monster. If you do, place it in your monster zone and use its monster effect in the bottom box. Be careful with your choice, because once you've summoned it as a monster or played it as a spell in the Pendulum zone, you can't change it to the other type while it's on the field. If a Pendulum monster card on the field would be sent to the graveyard, place it face up in your extra deck instead. This happens whether the Pendulum monster card was a monster or a spell at the time. Now let's talk about how to do the Pendulum Summon itself. First, you need a Pendulum monster card in each Pendulum zone. You can Pendulum Summon once per turn in your main phase. Check the Pendulum scales on the sides of the 2 cards in your Pendulum zones. In one Pendulum Summon, you special summon as many monsters as you want. They can come from your hand or from the face-up Pendulum monster cards in your extra deck. The only thing is that the level of each monster you summon has to be in between the Pendulum scales you have in your Pendulum zones. Now let's see it in action. Your hand has 2 Pendulum monster cards, Stargazer Magician and Time Gazer Magician. Place each one in a Pendulum zone. Like any spell card, you can play more than 1 in a turn. Their Pendulum scales are 1 and 8. That means you can Pendulum Summon any number of monsters between levels 2 and 7, like so. You can only Pendulum Summon once per turn, but you can Pendulum Summon as many monsters as you want at that time. The Pendulum monster cards in your Pendulum zones remain there, so you can Pendulum Summon every turn. Remember, Pendulum monster cards on the field that would go to the graveyard are placed face up in the extra deck instead, and can be Pendulum Summoned just like monsters in your hand. Pendulum Summoning makes it easier to Xyz, Synchro, and Fusion Summon, especially if you Pendulum Summon more Pendulum monsters. Xyz summons work just like normal. Synchro summons become even better with Pendulum monsters. Using a Pendulum monster as Synchro material sends it to the extra deck, so you can Pendulum Summon it again. Fusion summons using Pendulum monsters on the field as fusion materials will also send them to the extra deck. They'll still go to the graveyard if you use them as materials straight from your hand, though. Of course, you can always just attack with all your Pendulum summoned monsters to score a big win. Pendulum summons make incredible combos possible. Do some experimenting and discover new strategies for yourself.